You're listening to the Baumbastic Podcast with Andrew Ellis on Inside Arkansas.
And what's going on, everybody, and welcome back to the Baumbastic Podcast presented by Inside Arkansas. I'm your host, Andrew Ellis, and I am joined by a very special guest, a guest that probably doesn't need an introduction, but I'm going to give it to him anyway. He's Andrew Hutchinson, NWA Hutch. You probably know him from his great writing work, his award-winning journalism, right? At least one or two awards, right?
I do have one Sports Writer of the Year award for Arkansas.
Just one?
Yeah, just one.
Just that 1 year, you were really good. Outside of that, it's been hit or miss, I guess, is what they say.
I got sandwiched in between Bob Holt, so
there you go.
I'll take it.
There you go. Well, maybe one day you can win one of the awards named after Bob Holt, because I think we got a few of those now. But yeah, if you don't know Andrew, you can check out his work at Best of Arkansas Sports, and he's worked at a few different outlets. Graduate of the University of Arkansas, and about as good as it gets when it comes to covering all three of the major sports programs. But deep down, we all secretly know he's a baseball guy. And maybe the casual fan doesn't know that, because I feel like you do a pretty good job of covering all the sports. You're a good, like, kind of do it all kind of guy. You're a glue guy that can do it all. But I think that, those that really know you're really a baseball guy at heart, right?
Oh, yeah. I mean, if anybody asks, I always tell them my favorite sport to cover is baseball. And, I mean, there's many reasons for that. One, they're consistently good. And Dave Van Horn is great when it comes to talking to the media. He shoots you straight. So, and plus, it's just a lot more laid back, as you know, up there in the press box. And it's easy to do that when you got 56 games to cover during a regular season.
Exactly. It's a lot easier to just kind of enjoy the games and enjoy the highs and lows and not freak out all the time. Although the fan base still likes to do that. I mean, they'll lose one midweek game and they'll be calling Matt Hobbs trash in no time. And we can't wait for it. I think we're Norm DeBryan days away from Arkansas baseball. I think we were at number 23 now. And I was thinking of it. I was like, can't think of any good 23s. And I guess it's because of Norm. they don't really give that number out. But Hutch, you wrote a really good piece the other day, kind of detailing some of the biggest questions that this Arkansas baseball team kind of needs to answer before the season starts. And obviously they'll be starting practice on Friday. So hopefully we'll get some resolution to some of those. And I want to talk about that here in a second. But first, we got to start with the elephant in the room. The elephant in the room is this Arkansas baseball program, for all of its success, for all of its SEC titles, its great moments, its awesome players, its draft picks. You could actually make an argument. I saw today that they were like number 2 nationally in average RPI in the last 5 years, which is, notable and nothing to scoff at. But as you know, this fan base is desperate for the big one. And so how frustrating has it been to cover a program that's, on paper, by every metric you want to use, as good as just about any program in the country? They're clearly competing on a national level, but it just seems like none of it's going to matter if they don't get the big one. How annoying has that been to kind of cover and deal with all these narratives the last several years?
It's disappointing, one, for Dave Van Horn, because he's a guy that's easy to like, easy to cover, as I said earlier. And, he's living his dream. I mean, he played here and now he came back and is coaching. He probably could have left whenever he wanted to, but, he's here living his dream. And you'd like to see a guy like that win a national title. I mean, I feel like that about a lot of coaches that are out of school for 20 plus years. And then, throw in the fact that there's become this expectation from fans where if they don't win it all, it's a disappointment, that it was a terrible season. Like these last 2 years where they've lost in a home regional have been just an absolute failure. That's unfortunate because it's really fun leading up to that. I mean, the team is really good. You get to cover great players. I mean, Hagen Smith last year, getting to see him in person was awesome. Kevin Kopps a few years back was incredible stuff that I'm going to remember the rest of my life. And people don't link back to it the same because they don't win a national title. And I don't like that, because I feel like if the football team was consistently a top 10 team and just never won a college football playoff, people would still be pretty excited about the football team every year. They'd be like, all right, is this the year? And there's still a little bit of that, but I feel like there's become more and more apathy with the fan base where they're like, well, it's just going to be another disappointment. They're not going to win it all. And that's, to me, that's an unfair standard to set when it's so hard to win a national title. I mean, everyone sees like, oh, well, Tony Vitello won one last year, so whatever. But like, it's really, really hard. And to me, it's enjoy getting to see these great players that are going to be playing in the big league someday. Enjoy the wins, you get a lot more wins in baseball than you do the other sports, especially right now. So it's to me, that's what's annoying about it, is that it's kind of set that standard. But I guess that's the cost of being as successful as they have been.
Yeah, definitely kind of a victim of their own success. And what do they say in Moneyball? Nobody cares unless you win the last game of the year, which I always think about. I watched that movie about a month ago to get in the right mindset for baseball season. I think a lot of it also is like baseball's obviously, we love it, and it's our favorite sport to cover and talk about. And I'm sure there's a lot of Razorback fans who really do live and die with baseball. That's their thing. But it's a little bit more of a niche sport. And so for I think the casual fan, it's like, I don't want to watch 60 games if you're not going to win a title. It's like they kind of view baseball as kind of that secondary thing, like kind of how we view some of the other sports on campus. Like, I mean, track has had a ton of national success, so we like to note that. But like, soccer or whatever, where it's like I'm only really going to pay attention if you're really in the big one. And so I wonder if there's a lot of fans who kind of view baseball like that. But for you personally, and I know you'll, based on your answer there, I'm sure you will kind of view it the same way I do. But do you think there's anything that can happen in this regular season that would really get this fan base behind this baseball team? Or do you think it's going to be one of those things where people just kind of sit around and are like, all right, they're winning all these games, they're first place in the SEC, but they're going to choke when it matters? Or do you think there's anything that can happen in this regular season that would really get fans to be like, hey, this might be a fun team. Like, this might be the team. Would it really, do you think we'll see that where the teams will really get behind them the way they did in 2021?
It would take something big. I mean, it's unfortunate in a way that the schedule is so backloaded. I mean, that closing stretch of the schedule with, LSU, Texas, Tennessee, I can't remember which order it is, but you get all those teams to end the year. If you could have had that at the beginning of the year and you go 6-3 against those teams and, win all 3 series, like, then you would get some real genuine excitement because you're like, oh, well, that's the cream of the crop. They beat the best teams in the country, including a Tony Vitello and a Texas team and an LSU team that are rivals. So that would have helped. But with that being at the end of the schedule, that's kind of close to the postseason. I mean, maybe the only thing I could think of that would really get people excited is if this offense comes out and does what they're saying they can do, which is not only hit a bunch of home runs, which we've seen in several years, but like manufacture runs and be an exciting product to watch, where it's not just the what is it, the 3 true outcomes, and get some action on the bases, some stolen bases, some hit and run, so just some exciting stuff like that. I think might get people believing, because like, oh well, this is different, and maybe that'll lead to something different in the postseason.
Yeah, you led me right into my next point. I was going to kind of ask about that offense. You and I have talked about this a lot, the Nate Thompson thing, because everyone just views it as like Nate Thompson is the enemy. Nate Thompson has ruined Arkansas baseball, and he's ruining all these swings and all that. And I think we both agree that it's a little bit of an overblown narrative, but there is definitely some numbers the last few years. Like you look back at 2018, 2019, Arkansas was in the top 20, 25 nationally in pretty much every offensive statistic. Even 2021, they the batting average dipped a little bit, but ton of home runs, ton of walks. I think they were top 15 in scoring that year as well. And I feel like the last few years, it's taken a little bit of a step back. And what you've seen is some of these other programs have really just upped, it's an arms race that's getting crazy. I mean, Arkansas hit, I believe it was like 100 or maybe 98 home runs in 2018. And I remember at the time being like, this is crazy. They almost had 100 home runs. Like, no one's ever going to do that ever again. And in Tennessee last year, I think they hit like 150 or something stupid like that. Like, just crazy. And so I think Arkansas has kind of been left behind a little bit. And so I wonder, like, and I want to hear your opinion, like, Arkansas has been kind of in that 9 to 11 range in all the SEC stats the last few years. Do you feel like it's going to be kind of more of the same and it's going to be more of a dependence on the pitching staff? Or do you think they're going to kind of maybe close the gap between the Tennessees and the A&Ms of the world, and maybe not have 5 guys that hit 20 home runs like Tennessee last year, but do you think they can maybe catch up in that department a little bit?
I think that's one of the biggest storylines to follow this year. And I'm not 100% like convinced one way or the other. I think there is the potential for them to be better. And I think it's the way, I think you maybe have been a little bit skeptical on this in the past, but like, I like what I've heard from Dave Van Horn in terms of like how they built this roster, how how they attacked the fall scrimmages, including all the situational work and stuff that we hadn't seen before in previous fall scrimmages. So like they are implementing things that are different. And I'm just really hoping to see that is implemented in real games and stuff like that. So, I mean, I could see it impacting the scoring. You like to think the batting average will be a little bit better. I mean, obviously that's not the end all be all statistic. But I do think, maybe they don't hit as many home runs as those teams, but I'd like to see them be able to score runs in other ways. I think that's the big thing. And I think that'll tell us a lot about Nate Thompson, and Dave Van Horn's ability to adapt. He seems to be adapting better than most older coaches in this era of college athletics. So I'm very curious to see how that goes, because I'm optimistic, but I'd probably say I'm cautiously optimistic, especially with, I think I was talking about this with somebody else the other day, but like the way the schedule lays out, like the easier SEC series are at the beginning of the schedule. And so they may not have to do those. They may not have to manufacture runs against those teams. They may hit the ball out of the park and just, run away from some teams. And at that point, they're like, well, that's what we're going to do because we're good at it. Or do they make it a point like, hey, we're going to work on this stuff. We're going to work on the hit and run. We're going to work on, moving runners, stealing bases, things like that early on, even if they don't necessarily need it. Also a non-conference play, for sure. So I'm very much in wait and see mode with that, but I am optimistic that they will close the gap, at least in scoring. Maybe not, the other, sexier stats or whatever, but if they could do a little bit more small ball, not old school, bunt every time you get a guy on base or whatever, but just a little bit more, I think would be an encouraging sign to see.
Yeah, I really liked what DVH said the other day in his press conference, where he was like, we feel like we needed to make some adjustments. We knew we had to evolve, kind of change the way we did things. But make no mistake, you still need power, and we got power, which I really appreciated that he threw that in, because I think there were a lot of fans who were like, Hogs are going to be they're going to be wheeling and dealing and bunting and hit and run and all this stuff. And I'm like, okay, let's pump the brakes. And I think a lot of times what you'll see is, you kind of touched on it there, like the schedules earlier in the early part, it's a little bit easier when you're facing bad catchers and you're facing pitchers that are throwing 88. A little bit easier to do some of that stuff, a little bit easier to steal a bag or maybe call a hit and run because you're going to be able to make contact. You face these dudes that are throwing 97 and it's like, we need any runs we can get. Let's just draw a walker and hit a bomb. I think, and ultimately, I think what you need to do is you need to be prepared for everything. That's what ultimately prepares you for the postseason. Is you need to be able to score runs. You need to be able to hit the long ball, but you also need to be able to get that runner in from third. You need to be able to do all the little things. And I feel like this Arkansas team, there's been like some red flags that we've kind of ignored in the regular season, where it's like, they might not have this. They might not be prepared for any situation. I feel like the Hog teams lately have been kind of built to, if everything goes on schedule, if Hagen Smith goes 6 and you're able to get Fouch for 1 and get Gackle for 2 or whatever, if everything goes on schedule, everything's fine. But if maybe you fall behind 5-2, it's like, oh, they're in trouble there. But I definitely like the roster. And I think this roster is a little bit more well-rounded, specifically with the position players, and maybe equipped to do some of those things. And speaking of some of those players, Hutch, if you're like me, and in baseball, a lot of times you are. I feel like we share a name, even though we don't call each other that name. Neither of us do. You call me Ellis, and I call you Hutch, but we do share a name. And we also sometimes share a brain sometimes, where I feel like we view these things similarly. But if you're like me, you were a little surprised when DVH just casually threw in. He's like, yeah, Rocco Pepe, first base. That's where he's going to be. And we're like, what? And we're like all scribbling out what we had written down. And we're like, okay. And so I thought about it for a little bit. I was surprised. But then after like 2 minutes, I was like, makes a lot of sense. And it kind of maybe solves the outfield conundrum. So how do you feel about that? Like, do you feel like it is as simple as Pepe's at first, Aloy DH, now you've got your outfield set? Did that kind of clear up some, I guess, not concerned, but some questions for you entering this season?
It definitely makes me feel better that they have another option there. Because, I know they brought in the Michael Anderson kid from Rhode Island. He didn't have the best fall. And so you got him, Kuhio Aloy, he hasn't played a whole lot of first base in his career, but I guess the same thing can be said about Rocco Pepe, which it did surprise me. And Dave Van Horn even said this, like, you can't just throw a guy out there at first base and expect him to just play well. I remember they tried that in a regular season a few years back with Hunter Wilson, and it was just an absolute disaster for the one game they did. Like and it's not his fault. I'm not bashing on him. He just is not used to first base. It's a different position, and so I'm curious to see if he can handle it. Some guys can handle the transition really well. Trevor Ezell was a natural second baseman, moved to first base, and voila, he was an all SEC, defensive guy there, despite being, 5'2" or whatever he was. No, sorry, Trevor. I know you're taller than that.
Just a ricochet shot at the SEMO hitting coach. Wow, that's crazy.
No, he was great. And I mean, so maybe we see something like that with Rocco Pepe, because I like what, he brings to the table with his bat. You'd like to get his bat in the lineup. And, if you look at the outfield, you mentioned the outfield conundrum. I mean, you feel good about Charles Davelin in center field, but the corner spots are still kind of up in the air. I mean, you got Kendall Diggs coming back. I mean, if he can return to 2023 Kendall Diggs, fantastic. You got an borderline all SEC kind of guy out there. Then you got another spot. Do you put Logan Maxwell there, a guy from TCU? You've got other guys that can go in there. But I mean, Rocco Pepe is going to be right in that mix. And if he could play first, if Aloy's brother isn't as, can't handle the first base duties, at least you have some flexibility there to kind of, you're not locked into him having to play first. Or although I'm kind of curious to see, there's still kind of that battle at second base. To me, I think it's Nolan Souza, but you've got the Cam Kojal from the transfer from Vandy, who's getting a lot of preseason hype. He kind of struggled in the fall based on what we saw, but he's a talented guy, and maybe they get him in the lineup by moving him to first base, or maybe Nolan Souza could play first base, if they put Kojal at second. So it sounds like they're trying everything. I do like the idea of having Pepe there, but that was, as you said, an eye-opener to me whenever he just kind of casually dropped it on us.
Yeah, I really, and like you said, I like having the options. I mean, you got Pepe, a older guy, a right-handed hitting guy. Aloy also potentially a big power bat, right-handed. Michael Anderson's kind of like, I feel like Michael Anderson, this might be unfair to him, kind of the fallback option where it's like, if all else fails, we've got this guy who's got 23 home runs and is probably the best defender. DVH kind of alluded to that in the fall when we talked to him, that he's like, hey, we actually feel pretty good about his defense, even though he's a humongous. He's like 6'5". He looks like a first baseman. Like if that team was getting off the bus, I'd be like, that's the first baseman, and that's Caglione right there. He looks like him. But then you've got some left-handed bats. I mean, Robinette's another guy that they're maybe thinking of kind of moving there. Left-handed bat with him, left-handed bat with Kojal as well. So it's like there's at least options. And ultimately with this coaching staff, they seem to always figure it out one way or another. I'm sure we'll see no shortage of guys rotate over there. But, you mentioned it earlier with Ezell. Stovall's another example of that. Even Brady Slavin's kind of wasn't. I don't think he came to Arkansas as a first baseman. There was also the Matt Goodhart thing. You remember when he was playing first base for a little bit? So they've had some like trial and error at first base, but they seem to like having like the option of moving someone over to first base. Like they've successfully done it a few times. And so they've got themselves some options, and we'll see who kind of hits their way into the lineup. But moving over to the pitching side of things. So obviously we've all kind of done the bit where we know who the guys are. There's not a ton of like question marks. This time last year, if you and I were talking, I think we both would have been pretty confident that Mason Molina was going to be awesome. Like we thought he was going to be, pretty consistent. We knew Hagen Smith was Hagen Smith. Brady Tiger, we felt pretty good about him. He had a lot of buzz coming in. I probably wouldn't have been like extremely confident, but I definitely didn't think it would have gone as poorly as it did. So with that in mind, obviously there's not a Hagen Smith in this group, or at least, right now. I don't think you're expecting anyone to have the kind of year he had and be a top 10 pick. But are you maybe more confident that Arkansas is going to have a better overall rotation with the guys like Beidelshees, Root, and maybe even Gage Wood and Gackle in there?
I am, because one, you just mentioned four names. Last year it was these three guys are going to be the guys, and we really didn't know who else would be in there if they weren't. And we kind of saw that down the stretch whenever, they had to change things up. The fact that they've got four guys there that all have pretty good experience. I mean, Gackle's maybe the one, kind of somewhat wild card in that he never started a game last year, but he's so talented. He's kind of on that track of, be a closer as a freshman and then move into the starting rotation as a sophomore. See that a lot in college baseball. I feel confident. He's got all the talent in the world. I feel confident in Root and Beidelshees and Wood, or at least confident enough that of those four, three of them are going to emerge as at least very good starters, if not, great all SEC. Some of those guys have been all America type preseason accolades. So that it gives me a lot of optimism that they just have an extra option, that if one guy doesn't work out, you've got somebody waiting there. I mean, I hate to bring up another sport, but it reminds me of like kind of the situation the basketball team's in right now. Like you only have 9 guys. The reason you have 12 or 13 is so that way if one of those guys doesn't work out, you have another guy that maybe is better than you expected. And the same thing can be applied to this starting rotation. You got 4 capable guys. Surely 3 of them will pan out, and then you've got another guy waiting in the wings in case there's an injury or something like that happens.
Yeah. I mean, we're talking about the 4 guys who I think that's kind of what it comes down to. But I mean, you've also got to take into account, you've got some wild cards on the roster, like Hunter Dietz. We don't know what that's going to be like. We have no idea. Hunter Dietz could throw anywhere from 4 to 90 innings and be, anything, nothing would surprise me. You could talk me into anything with him. Carson Wiggins is another one. Dave kind of referenced, he was like, hey, maybe we start him, which I don't think he was serious, but like, you've got some really talented pieces. Colin Fisher's obviously a guy that started games for them last year in the midweek role. I think Cole Gibbler's another one as a freshman that I don't know, thankfully he's not in a situation where he's being rushed into a weekend starting role, but you got a lot of potential wild cards where if push came to shove, you might be able to lean on one of those guys. But speaking of this, just the starting, the 4 guys that we're talking about here, Gackle, you mentioned not having any starting experience. Probably the one that we're most confident is going to be in the rotation, weirdly enough. I mean, he might be the most talented out of all of them. You could easily make that case. I feel like Root is the other like semi-lock, just because I don't know how you use him if it's not as a starter. I feel like he's got the arsenal, got kind of that strike throwing, left-handed mentality. Like he makes sense as a starter. And so it really, for me, kind of comes down to Wood or Beidelshees. And you could really make a case for either one of them. I don't know if you agree with this, Hutch. I don't really care. Like Beidelshees is obviously closed at different points in his career. And that outing that he had against Oklahoma State in the fall, where he just came in there and pumped cheddar, that kind of like made me view him in a completely different light, where I'm like, maybe the best way to use him is in the back end of the bullpen. Of course, Gage Wood has also got some closing experience. Seems like Gage Wood might have the perfect skill set for that, like, do everything reliever type. But do you really have I mean, I'm sure you don't yet at this point, but like, do you feel like it really matters a ton who ends up being that third starter? Because like you said, you've got the other one to fall back on, and both of those guys could be real weapons in the back of the bullpen. Like, I feel like all those 4 guys are going to throw a ton. Like, do you, as of today, do you have like a lean of like where you would maybe prefer them to go?
I think the way, if I was drawing it up right now, which again, Dave Van Horn knows way more about baseball than you and me, I would have, Gackle, I would have Root in there because of the 4 guys, he has the least experience coming out of the bullpen. He has a little bit, but not much. He's been primarily a starter at East Carolina. And the other 3 have been closers at various times. And then I think I would go Gage Wood. Partially just because I've always had a soft spot for in-state guys. So I'll admit my bias right there. As an in-state guy myself, I've got a little bit of bias there. Plus, I mean, you stole it right out of my mouth. The Oklahoma State appearance for Beidelshees, where he came out. I mean, he was throwing like 95, 96, 97 every single pitch. And then afterwards he told us like, yeah, that was my goal. I was going to go in there and I was going to throw it as hard as I could every single pitch, because I guess he had heard the talk or whatever, that he wasn't as hard of a thrower as these other guys. And, his off-speed stuff is, I think maybe what people like the most about him. I didn't know he could throw that hard, to be 100% honest with you. And so he was out there to show people like me that he was capable of it. And I like the idea of having him, maybe not necessarily in a closing role, but a guy who could finish games. Maybe if Gackle gives you 6 on Friday night, turn things over to Beidelshees, let him throw the last 3, and then you have, Fouch or whoever to close games on Saturday and Sunday. I kind of like having him as that wild card piece. But, if you get to a point where you just need him for an inning, throw him for an inning, let him turn it loose, let him pump 96, 97, in there at guys. So I that's how I would go. But again, it would not hurt my feelings if it's Wood who comes out of the bullpen or whoever.
Yeah, I'm kind of at that point where like, if someone wants to really like argue strongly, I'm going to be like, okay, cool. Like, sure, throw Beidelshees in there, throw whoever. Like, it doesn't really matter to me. But I think I agree. Like, and another thing to mention is Gage Wood's a guy that obviously Hawk fans are familiar with. he seems to be taking the proper strides throughout his career. I mean, as a freshman, we saw kind of the high leverage, like you saw the flashes. I thought he was a little bit more consistent last year, and then he even got some starting opportunities down the stretch, threw a ton more strikes. I felt like this offseason, he really was like kind of a light bulb going off moment for him. He was really good in the Cape, really good in the fall. And so I think if you were just basing it off of who's earned it, now obviously you've got a few outings here before the season started. And so we'll see how that works out. But like, I just feel like Gage Wood has kind of positioned himself well, and probably, and again, you're also going to play 4 games to start the year. So really, you might have to just wait until that series plays out. But I want to ask you about a couple of some of these freshmen that I alluded to, in Carson Wiggins and Cole Gibbler, who are, no matter where you look, whatever prospect list you're looking at, they're on it, especially Carson Wiggins, where I don't think many of us really expected him to ever wear that Razorback uniform in an official capacity. It's kind of weird where Arkansas is at a point where you probably shouldn't depend on your freshmen too much with the way Arkansas's staff lays out. You've got a ton of older guys, but pretty much every year for the last several years, Arkansas has depended on a freshman in some form or fashion, a lot of times to close games. What do you make of these 2 freshmen? Like, do you feel like they kind of fit right in with the Tigert and Smith and Woods and Gackles of the world? Like, do you see them kind of going right into a role like that?
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that. I remember talking to Matt Hobbs before, I think last season, and he made a comment saying it was kind of a moment where he kind of dipped into recruiting mode. He was like, if you look at it, we have had more innings by freshmen than pretty much any other SEC team in the last however many years, he said. I can't remember what. And I didn't fact check him on the stat, but I mean, if you think about it, they've always had a guy or 2 that are freshmen that contribute heavily. And I could definitely see, those guys coming in, and, with Gibbler, I would not be surprised if he's a midweek starter. Maybe not at the beginning of the year, but maybe he evolves into a midweek starter by, at some point during the season. And he's a guy that can start a game in a do or die situation in the postseason. I think he's got that ability. Even though he doesn't light up the radar gun like Wiggins does, but the dude can really pitch. He's a guy I talked to last summer before the draft, and he told me his goal is to be better than Hagen Smith, and that's a lofty goal.
Quite the goal.
We'll see if he can come anywhere close to that. But even if he falls a little bit short, you could still be a very, very good pitcher. So I really like what he can do. And then Wiggins, that's a guy Dave Van Horn said could be a starter in the future, but maybe he comes out of the pen. I want to see kind of how, if he has the mindset mentality to handle those pressure situations. You remember we saw his brother, Jackson Wiggins, get some closing opportunities early on, and it started out really well, and then maybe it didn't go so well. And maybe, who knows? I mean, maybe he's got that closer mindset that we've seen with a Tigert, with a Wood, with a Gackle, whoever. That I think is kind of a to be determined, but regardless, I see him playing a big role as a key arm on this staff because he's just too talented not to. The guy that already touching triple digits on the radar gun, you're going to find a way to get him in the game, and especially when I think he's a draft eligible sophomore, so you only got him for 2 years. You gotta use him when you can.
If you don't use it, you lose it. That's what they say. But Jackson, you mentioned his brother Jackson, who again is one of these freshmen that has taken on a massive role for Arkansas. I think Gackle threw 43 innings last year, and Hagen and Tiger probably even threw more than that in their freshman seasons. I really think Arkansas, if Wiggins is throwing more than 40 innings, I feel like something went wrong, or they decided to make him a starter. Like, I think that Christian Fouch, what they did with him is kind of the basis of how they should probably use some of these younger, high leverage arms, like a Dietz would kind of fit in that category as well. So I hope that Arkansas is in a position to where they can be a little bit more conservative on how they use some of these guys. With Gibbler, I think back to Patrick Wicklander's freshman year, where he started in that midweek role and did a really good job. And then by the end of the year, that team was a little bit different because they had Isaiah Campbell and then no other starting option. So then him and Nolan kind of get thrust into that role. I don't think Gibbler is going to be thrust into a weekend starting role, but I think Gibbler is going to be a guy that pitches on midweeks, like you said, and maybe proves to be too valuable to leave in that role. And so then they'll have a decision to make on how to use him. Before I let you get out of here, Hutch, I got to ask you, you got to stake your claim now. This is a little bit off the wall. Is there anybody who you feel like is maybe not getting the love they deserve preseason, or just kind of tentatively heading into the 2025 season, that's like your guy that you want to, we need to give you credit for when they have a big game? oh, Andrew Hutchinson called it. Like, who is like your guy that you feel like we haven't been talking about enough?
It's hard to say because I forget like how you and I talking about this. We talk about everybody, so it's like, okay, who have we not really talked about? But maybe a guy that doesn't maybe get as much love from the fan base is I mentioned him earlier, Charles Davlin, which I'm not 100% sure if I'm saying his name correctly. But
I was gonna ask you actually. I was gonna be like, "Are we going?" I don't know how to say his name either. But Daniel Shee told me it was Davaillon or something weird like that.
yeah, I mean, he
I'm
is
not doing
French.
that.
He is French
Yeah.
Canadian. Like he legitimately speaks French. So I mean, you've got kind of that exotic feel to it, kind of like you do with Brent Iredale, if we're being honest, the guy from Australia. But I feel like he's getting more pub right now than Charles Davlin is, and I just think he is your prototypical leadoff guy, center fielder. I really believe in his tools. I know he didn't put up like the biggest, sexiest numbers at Florida Gulf Coast, which again is a smaller school, so there's worries there. But based on everything Dave Van Horn has said, it sounds like he's kind of locked down that job in center field. And generally, if Dave says that about you, then you're pretty good. Like for the most part, you're a pretty good center fielder. Now, obviously, last year was a little bit of an exception. Ty Wilmsmeyer never truly panned out offensively, at least. Very good defender. But in the past, I mean, it took a little bit, but Braden Webb was, got a lot of hype in the preseason, got off to a slow start, and then was really, really good. Obviously the center fielders before that, we all know. I mean, the Christian Franklins, the Dominic Fletchers, et cetera, Andrew Benintendi. I'm not ready to say he's one of those guys, but I do think he's going to be a guy that surprises people in how talented he is. And I think he could be really fun to watch it too. I mean, I think he's a guy that can be doing a little bit of that small ball stuff, stealing bases, laying down bunts, stuff like that out of that leadoff spot. So if I had to pick one, I think he's a guy that maybe doesn't get as much attention or love from the fan base as he probably will during the season.
I really like that pick. I'm glad you went that direction. I was a little worried you were going to be like, I tell you, I'm going to go with Brent Iredale. Because if you look at the national rankings, he's not necessarily, I don't think people are expecting him to come in and hit 400, but like Hog fans, I think we all we know we got something with Brent Iredale. We kind of know there's something, we know something that they don't know. So I was worried you were going to be like, oh, I got this guy, Vahiva Aloy. That's why I think he's going to have a good year. But no, I love the Davlon pick for sure. And well, Hutch, man, I appreciate you for coming on the podcast and joining me. I always love talking ball with you, man. It's actually stunning how aligned we are. I feel like normally going into a year, we at least have some bit of dissension, because me and you talk ball a lot. There's usually like maybe one or two guys. Last year, I'll admit, so Ty Wilmsmeyer, I'll do my victory lap. I knew he was going to stink, but I also said Jared Sprague was going to stink, and he didn't stink. He was very, very solid, very dependable. And so we'll call it even. We'll call it even on those two guys. But yeah, I was kind of stunned. I mean, and the people that are listening to the show, that listen to me ramble every day, they're probably like a lot of what you said, they've been hearing me ramble about. So I'm glad that we're as aligned as we are. I feel like that's a good sign, good omen.
Yeah, we've got 3 weeks of preseason scrimmages for us to diverge in our opinions. So
yeah,
maybe we need to reconvene here after 3 weeks and see if we're still as aligned as we are now.
There you go. I like that. All right, man. Well, I appreciate you for joining us. And if for everyone listening, go check out all of Hutch's work, man. Nobody is better at just taking a detail-oriented approach and just really diving into whatever the biggest stories are in Arkansas sports, football, basketball, baseball. And of course, as we said, he's a baseball guy. So be tapped in with him all season. And we'll definitely have to get you back on the Baumbastic podcast to make sure we're still on the same page and we're locked in. And maybe we'll even we'll relive our Omaha trip that we had in 2022. Hopefully it's a little bit more structured, but we'll survive in advance. But appreciate you for joining me and hope everyone enjoyed this edition of the Baumbastic Podcast.